So my name is Matthew Covey. I am the executive director of Tamizdat, which is a nonprofit based in New York that does a lot of stuff, all related to artist mobility issues. The reason I'm here, aside from to meet with all of you, is to be here for the Arts and Culture Summit, which is happening right now here in Stockholm, mostly because of the work that I do and that Tamizdat does for persecuted artists and artistic freedom issues. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. I'm also an immigration attorney, and I run a law firm that mostly focuses on immigration issues for performing artists, mostly going into the US, although we do work in other parts of the world as well. So what I'm here to talk about is broadly the legal issues about sending artists to the US. There's a lot of information. If you have questions, don't wait until the end. Like, ask me as we go along, because if you wait, by the time we get to the end, the question you have now will not make any sense by the end. So just ask in context, and then feel free to just sort of shout or raise your hand or whatever you want to do. The PowerPoint that I'm going to do, you can all have it. I can send it to Jesper, and Jesper can send it around if you want to get it. It's also, there's a couple of flow charts which you might want to take pictures of, because this is all very legal and might be hard. It's hard for me to follow, so if it's hard for me to follow, I'm sure it's hard for you to follow too. So it might be good to be able to loop back to that. Just to start with, I want to get a sense of who does what here. How many people are artists? Awesome, cool. How many people are management? There we go. Agents? Okay. Labels? Okay. Anything else? Am I missing anybody? Other lawyers? Okay. So you can call me out if I say something wrong. You're like, you're actually wrong. Okay, so, but yeah, that's good to know. I will try to gear it toward all of these topics, but again, if I'm not clear about something, please feel free to say so. This is yours. You left your coffee at home. Do you want it? I was about to drink it. No, I'll put it right here.
You will survive.
I have my own.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so the first thing we want to talk about is, here, see, it's a flowchart. The first thing I want to talk about is when you need a visa and when you don't need a visa. If everyone here has a Swedish passport or an EU passport, then you know probably that you can travel to the US, most of you, unless you've got a criminal record, you can travel to the US without getting a visa on what we refer to as ESTA, or the visa waiver. So if you've gone to visit family or gone to Disney World or to something like that on holiday, you've probably just traveled on ESTA, which means you go online, pay $15 some days before you travel, and you don't have to get a visa. Okay? That's great in most situations, but ESTA only allows you to do certain things in the US. In other words, you can't be a student, you can't work, can't do research, a bunch of other things. There's a very limited number of things you can do on ESTA. So the first thing I want to talk about is what are those limitations, because it's a source of a lot of confusion. Okay, actually, we'll just go do this here. Refer back to this as we move forward. What activities require a visa? The way that we do the analysis is this. If you're an artist and you're going to the US and you're going to be doing something professional, whether it's performing or recording or writing or meetings or whatever it might be, you start with the assumption that you need to have an employment-based visa. ESTA is not enough. And then, once you start from that assumption, then you work back and say, well, like, is there an exception to this rule that allows me to do this specific thing that I want to do? It's better to do it that way than what most artists do, which is go the other way, which is, oh, oh, I can go on ESTA and it'll be fine, right? And then you realize when you get there that it's not fine because they send you back home. So you want to avoid that situation. So start from the assumption that you need an employment visa, and then look at the exceptions to that rule. There's several exceptions. These are the ones that are most relevant to most artists who are working, most musicians, especially most pop, like pop, rock, electronic, dance, like that kind of music. An industry showcase event. This is the thing that causes probably the most confusion of anything. Here's the rule. This is the way to think about it. If you're going to the US to perform at an event, and the main reason that the audience is watching you is not because they want to have fun, it's because they are thinking about hiring you. Okay? If they're thinking about hiring you, then the chances are good that you're at an industry showcase event, and what you're doing would be considered an audition more than a performance, in which case you probably don't need to have an employment-based visa. Now this is what's important to understand, is that ESTA costs like $15, and you can do it like 48 hours before you get on the plane. If you need an employment-based visa, these are usually the P visas or the O visas, they cost thousands of dollars, and you need to do them, you need to start ideally like 5 months before you travel, okay? So there's a really big difference between going on ESTA and going with a employment or a work visa. So that's why I'm making this big distinction. So, but if you're going to do a showcase event, like, here's where you start getting into it, South by Southwest, clearly a showcase event, sort of. Probably, you were just mentioning Music Biz in Nashville, probably that would also count. Folk Alliance, clearly a showcase event. APAP, I don't know if any of you know about that. That's the January New York conference. If you're performing in the conference, not one of the gigs that are in the city. There's a bunch of other regional events, Arts Midwest, Western Arts Alliance, those kinds of events. You're probably going to be fine traveling on ESTA because it would be considered an audition more than a gig. Yes?
At the border, should you say that you're there to do the showcase?
100%.
Okay.
And you should also make sure that you're traveling with an invitation from the event.
Okay.
Now, I think all of the showcase events that are legitimately showcase events in the US, we have worked with to make sure that the invitation that they will give you is legally solid.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry. Is there you might come to that. Is there a difference between if you're getting paid or if it's a non-paid event? Regardless, if you're taking out, I mean, obviously,
that's a really good
salary.
Yeah.
But if you're still getting $10,000 for an event,
yeah,
and it's a showcase audition,
uh-huh.
Are you allowed to receive that money?
It actually goes. It's worse than that. If you're getting paid, the presumption is it's not a showcase. So, like for example, at South by Southwest, almost everything is unpaid, or yeah, you don't get paid to do it. But sometimes, if you're a pretty big artist, there is some payment that sometimes happens.
But if it's to cover musicians and equipment, then production.
Still, at this present time, we're working on this. We're working with the U.S. government to try to figure out how to change this a little bit. If, for example, the Swedish government is sending you to perform at South by Southwest, and they're covering expenses for you, they've got grants and things like that, that's fine. You're not getting paid for it. You're not getting paid for the gig. They're paying for the showcase. But if you play and you get paid out after having been performed, then it's presumed it's not a showcase. But here's the problem. The problem is that with everything, with U.S. immigration law, and maybe everything in the U.S. in general, you have to think about it in two different ways. One, what does the law say? And then two, what actually happens in real life? Okay, so if you've got a really good invitation letter from South by Southwest, and you're coming as part of the Swedish delegation, when you get to the border, they're going to see this and they're going to be like, all right, you're fine. That's not a problem. That seems all very official, and they're not going to worry about it. But if you're playing, if somebody is organized a real showcase event in Chicago, I'm just choosing Chicago because it's where there aren't any other showcase events there. It's like there's only 3 bands playing. It's your label has put together a showcasey thing. The problem with that is like you're not getting paid for it, and it's but they're mostly inviting industry and press to come and see your show. The problem with that is it doesn't have any reputation as a showcasing event. So if you arrive with an invitation from some label and you fly into Chicago, at Customs and Border Protection, they'll be like, I've never heard of this. This doesn't sound like anything I know anything about, so I think you're making it up and I think you're coming to tour. So they might send you back. So this is a problem we come to with, say, for example, New Colossus Festival. Do you know that? Have you heard of this at all? New Colossus is a sort of music festival, sort of conference that happens in New York the week before South by Southwest. It's a really good idea. The idea is as people are on their way to Austin, you do a New York show. And the problem with it is it's sort of an industry event, but it's also they sell loads of tickets to the general public. So we've always said it's risky to play at New Colossus without an employment visa, because it's very possible that you could arrive at JFK and the officers say, oh, I see you're playing this festival, I see that you can buy tickets online, the general public, it's very public facing, so yeah, I think that you probably shouldn't be doing this without a visa, and they send you home because you should have come in with it. Is everything I'm saying sort of making sense so far, or is this just like, no? Okay, good. All right, I'm spending a lot of time on this showcasing thing because it's where a lot of people get confused. To your question about getting paid, I just want to say one thing. I'll hit it again later. But
it's paid or reimbursed, right?
Reimbursed is like if expenses are being paid, expenses are being covered, but the U.S. entity is not paying anything. So South by Southwest is not paying you anything. Then you're probably fine. But be careful. If you're not getting paid, that doesn't mean it's not working. A lot of people say, well, this is a free gig, so it must not be working, so it's fine to do this on ESTA, but that's not true. We'll get back to that in a second about why that's the case. If you're at an event which is sponsored entirely by your home country and it's free to the public, that's also fine to do. This is an exception that was created so that embassies could do cultural programming, but it's kind of expanded beyond that. France, every summer, has this huge French Day in Central Park where they have huge acts playing on the stage and there's thousands of people that show up. They pay the acts, but it's free, and the French government pays for the whole thing, so they don't need visas for that. If the Swedish government wants to do a big Swedish Day in Central Park, you also could not have visas for that. There are certain academic programs, so if you're a classical musician or a folk musician, you might be able to do it's very narrow, there might be some gigs that you could do at universities or colleges where you wouldn't need a visa. That's really narrow, so if you're doing it, as with all of these, if you're confused or have a question, part of the main thing that Tamizdat does is answers questions for free. So reach out to us if you're like, hey, is this going to be okay? I can talk with you about whether it's going to be okay, or one of my colleagues can. Yes?
How do the U.S. authorities do checkups on this? Do they actually visit sometimes the venue? And
no. What they do is when you're arriving, oftentimes if they have a question, they might Google what you're doing. Like Google your name. And so the thing that people you hear horror stories about South by Southwest with artists who go and they get turned away. Almost always the reason that happens is because they're coming to play in Austin at an official event, but they're also playing like the Converse All-Stars Barbecue. Oh, and they're also doing one other show in Houston before they go home. And so what happens when people get turned away when they're going to South by Southwest is almost always they arrive, the officer Googles them and sees you're not just playing an official South by Southwest showcase, you're playing this barbecue, you're playing this other event in the afternoon, you're playing this other gig. Those are not showcases, so you get sent home. Did that answer your question? So they've got better things to do with their time than actually go to venues and bust musicians. They're too busy. All right, I was going to get political there. They're too busy doing other things that are even worse. Okay. It's going to come back in a second. Yeah. Good. Okay. So, academic programs, if you're doing something at a university, check with me. Feel free to send me an email, or me and my colleagues, we can review what you're doing and say like, okay, this is cool, you can do this or not. Also, for the managers, there's a bunch of managers here. US law makes a distinction between a manager and a road manager. Which, if it's a stadium act, makes a lot of sense. If it's an independent act, it makes a lot less sense. This is an important distinction, though, because a manager doesn't need an employment visa to go to the US. A road manager does. That's especially important because it's a different visa. So if you're going to spend thousands of dollars and start months in advance to get the band a visa, you're going to have to also spend that same amount of money to get the road manager a visa, because they're crew. Right. So the difference really is a manager doesn't do something that's essential for the tour. So they're going to network, might go to some of the shows at the major markets, meet with the label, meet with major venues, maybe some festivals. They're there to network, whereas a road manager is there to advance the shows, settle up at the end of the night, make sure that the hotels work out, all those kinds of things. It's a really important distinction because, okay, imagine, well, here's going back to the topic of what's the law say and what is the reality of the situation. This is where it gets really confusing. Imagine you've got a band, you just played Montreal, the band's in a van, you're traveling to Boston to do your first US gig. The band is 4 men in their early 20s, unshaven, unwashed, wearing leather, in a van. We can all imagine this. And the manager is also a man in his early 20s, unshaven, unwashed, wearing leather. They come to the border. The officer might well say, you guys are all fine because you have employment visas. You don't, which means you're probably the drummer who failed to actually get the visa, because drummers tend to fail to get visas. In my experience, nothing against drummers, just is what it is. Even if you're really the road manager, you might have a problem there. Whereas, if you're the road manager and you're in your 50s and balding and overweight, you'll probably be fine, because they will say, yeah, that looks like a manager to me, in you go. So you have to be a little bit careful. If you're the manager and you're traveling without a visa, be a little bit careful. I had a very major Irish band recently traveling to the US with their manager, who actually was barred from going to the US. The band, huge band actually, entered the US on tour. The road manager got sent home. So they had to do their tour without a road manager, which was a mess, because they were not remotely responsible enough to do that. So be careful if you're a manager and you're sort of trying to get into help, and you've got important tasks for the tour, because it might not work. One other thing I want to mention here is recording. If you're going to the US to record, the rule is really weird. If you're recording pursuant to a contract with a non-US company, you don't need a visa. If you're going to record pursuant to a contract with a US company, you need an employment visa. Basically, it's the difference between, are you going to spend money or are you going to make money? So if you're signed to a Swedish label but you want to use this specific producer and studio in the US, you're probably fine doing that. You get an invitation from the studio, you get an invitation from your Swedish record label saying, we are sending them to do this, you'll be fine. Even if you arrive with a ton of gear, if you've got the letter that says, we're going to Chicago to record with Steve Albini, you'll be fine. Whereas, if you're recording for a US label, then you should get the employment visa. Does that make sense?
So what, if you sign to a Swedish label who has a license deal with the US,
this goes back to what happens in real life. If the letter you have is a Swedish letterhead, you'll probably be fine. Same thing happens if you've got an international label. I've had many situations where somebody they're on Mute Records, and they get an invitation letter from Mute London to say what they're up to, not Mute New York. That way, when they arrive at Customs and Border Protection, they show the letter from Mute London saying they're going to record, and nobody's going to ask a question about that. It's a little risky because a very smart Customs and Border Protection officer could figure it out. But fortunately, there aren't very many very smart Customs and Border Protection officers, so you don't tend to figure that out.
But if you're going like independently without a big company behind you, and you have your own network of writers and producers in the States, so there's no like agreement prior to the trip, and no specific letter. Maybe you can show an email like we scheduled this. But,
yeah, you could. The less official it is, the more likely you might have a problem. But generally, if you can show, like, here's the thing. Again, most of the officers aren't that sophisticated. So, and you're coming from Sweden, right? So if you show up and you have a reasonable explanation, no, I'm paying for this myself, I'm doing some recordings, I'm from Sweden, you'll probably be fine. If you are from the global south trying to do that, you would probably not be fine, because because you have a significant advantage coming from Sweden with a Swedish passport over people coming from a lot of other parts of the world. You're not going to be seen as suspect. They don't think there's a lot of Swedes who want to immigrate illegally to the US. For obvious reasons. Why would you? Okay, so those are the main exceptions to this rule. So basically, again, to recap, you should, if you're going to the US to do something professional, you probably should get a P or an O employment visa. It's going to cost a ton of money, be a lot of time, unless one of these exceptions applies, in which case you probably can do it without it, but make sure you have documentation. And if you have a question, always feel free to ask us about it. Yes?
There's one segment that we haven't discussed, which is songwriting.
Right.
What goes for that?
Okay. It's a little bit like recording. If you're a songwriter and you're going to LA and you've got an Airbnb and you've got your laptop and you're going to sit on the veranda of your Airbnb and look at the waves and write songs for a month, they don't know the difference between that and a vacation. So you're fine. If you're going to Nashville to meet with 2 other Grammy Award-winning songwriters who, under contract to Warner Chappell, to write songs for the new Britney Spears album, that's a contract. You're going to do specific work, and if they start asking you hard questions, it's going to be hard to answer those questions honestly and not get sent home. So where's the dividing line? There isn't really one. It depends on what the officer had for breakfast as to whether they're going to say, like, that's probably fine, or no, I'm going to send you home. So be careful, but sort of the less formal it is, the more fine you'll be. Is that an okay answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Question?
Yes?
If you get denied an ESTA before even going there, or a visa before even going there,
Right.
is then the next step, is that because they think you're going to work there, so you need to apply for a work
You mean
visa?
you went online to try to register and it says no?
Yeah.
Okay. ESTA's a really bad system. The data system behind it is pathetic. It's like, I don't know. It's like technology circa 1998 or something like that, right? It's not good. The main reasons you'd be denied for ESTA is if at some point you've traveled to Iran or North Korea or Syria at some point in your life. If that comes up in your Interpol history, you'll probably be denied. If you have a criminal record, you'll probably be denied. If you are denied ESTA, but the thing that you're doing in the US is allowed without an employment visa, what you would need to do is you'd need to apply for a B1, B2 visa, which is what the rest of the world has to get to even go on vacation in the US. That's a visitor visa. And that's not that hard to do, and this actually raises the next topic here. It's not that hard. What you do is you go online, you fill out a form, you pay $190. You probably will have to go to the US Embassy, do a short interview, and then wait a week, and they'll give you an actual visa in your passport, which covers you for doing those kinds of. They're going to say, "What are you going to do?" And you're going to say, "Well, I'm going to play South by Southwest." And they'll be like, "All right, that's fine." It's a hassle, but in some ways it's better than ESTA because the decision has been made by a real human in the embassy. So if you have been watching what's happened in the last few years, prior to the pandemic, most of the showcase events in the US said, ESTA is fine legally, but you would be wise to get a B1 or B2 visa rather than traveling on ESTA. The reason for that is it's legally the same for these purposes, but getting an actual visa is a good idea because what it means is you've gone to an embassy, a US embassy or consulate, you've explained what you're doing, a real human has listened to you and said like, oh yeah, that makes sense, that is an industry showcase event, or you are performing at an event for your country, or you are going to record for a Swedish label. They've made that decision and given you a visa. So when you arrive at the airport, the officer there is going to look at your passport and say, I don't know what you're doing, but the US Embassy in Stockholm already said it's fine, so I'm not going to worry about it. Go ahead. Whereas if you go on ESTA, you're leaving it to that officer to make that decision. Is this really a showcase event? Is it really sponsored by the country? And that's scarier because you've already flown across the ocean and you've already committed all the expenses to this tour. And I would rather, if you're gonna have a problem, if I'm playing some weird showcase event, I would rather find out that I have a problem weeks before I travel at the embassy when they say like, I don't think New Colossus is really a showcase. I'd rather find that out weeks before than find it out when you arrive at JFK. Does that make sense? So that was the policy pre-pandemic by most of the showcasing events in the US. The problem right now, and we will come back to this a little bit more later, the problem right now is that the US embassies all around the world are a shit show. We had this president, I don't know if you heard about him, he was pretty bad. There were a lot of problems, one of which is the Foreign Service kind of, everybody quit, or at least a lot of people quit. They didn't really hire that many people to replace the people who quit. People that they did hire, a lot of them didn't really get trained. Then there was a pandemic, so anybody who was left went home. And then just as we're coming out of the pandemic, at least for European US consulates and embassies, there was Afghanistan and then there was Ukraine. So the issues of artists is sort of not that high on the list. So for artists to get visa appointments has been very, very hard for the last year. So South by Southwest and Folk Alliance both took the position, we worked together on this, took the position that while it's better to get a B1 visa under normal circumstances, the artists were having so many problems getting these B1 visas that they were better off getting ESTA rather than getting a B1 visa. So right now, if you're playing a showcase event in the next 6 months, probably going on ESTA is a better idea. We're hoping that by the end of the year, the embassies will be functioning a little bit better. They're hiring and training quickly right now. So probably by the beginning of next year, we'll be back to the old advice, which is you're better off getting a visa, even though you don't legally need it, just because it's safer to travel on a visa than travel on ESTA. Yeah?
And if you get denied a visa?
Yeah, are you speaking, not personally of course, but are you speaking from experience?
I have an artist who just got denied a visa.
There's always a reason for that, or there's almost always a reason for that. If it's rare that somebody gets denied a visa unless there's something going on, like whether it's from Sweden. If you're coming from the global south, you could easily be denied a visa for absolutely no reason at all. But if you're coming from Sweden and the artist has a Swedish passport, then if they get denied, you probably need help. And that's sort of where you should definitely call me and say, like, what's going on? Why did we get denied? We can look into the nature of the denial. If it's a criminal record, that's one topic, and there's different things you need to do to address that. If you have an artist who's a Swedish citizen, but they're a refugee, and they've recently become a Swedish citizen, that could be a reason for a denial. If you have an artist who's previously overstayed a visa in the US, that could be an issue. So there's legal processes that you go through in each of those different situations to overcome it, and usually you can. A drug conviction is pretty hard to overcome, so if that's what's on the record, then that may not be overcomable. They may just be stuck. Usually, it's usually not a problem, but obviously it is sometimes.
But
yes?
They can refuse you visa even if you don't have no criminal records, Swedish citizen with Swedish passport, and you can't appeal it. So
you can't appeal it,
outside of the U.S. administration as well.
You can't appeal it, but you can apply again.
No, you can't appeal it if it's on security grounds.
You can always apply again.
You can apply again. Yeah.
You can apply again. You file a new application, you apply again. And if it's my client, then I go to a congressional office and get a congressperson to contact the embassy to talk through what's going on. Probably get the promoters in the US, whoever's involved, to get their congressional representatives. So usually there's a way. Now, if it's a security issue and there's something very, I don't want to go into this too much because this is sort of very specific, but usually we often have situations where people are denied. We virtually always overcome them eventually. It sometimes takes a while. But yes, you're right, it does happen sometimes. Okay, so we've gone through all these exceptions to the rule. You've realized that your situation, you're not in an exception. You're going to have to get the employment visa. Okay, so what does that look like? That's basically if you're going to do anything if you're going to tour, if you're going for a recording session for a US label, pretty much anything else that isn't one of these exceptions, then you're going to have to get the employment-based visa. But wait, first, just for a second, can I just do this under the radar? Can I just go on ESTA? All my friends do, and it always works, right? So this is what I would say to that. If you're an artist and you have a great opportunity and you don't have the money to get a visa and you have a very high risk threshold, you're fine with risk, and maybe the US is not your most important market and it's going to be really fun, if you decide to go under the radar, that's your decision as an artist. Because if you do get turned around and you can't go back to the US for 6 years or whatever, that's on you. If you're management or a label or an agent, please don't tell your artist it'll be fine. Because it might not be, and if it isn't, if they do get there, you can't control what they're going to say. You can say like, hey, just say that you're going to go visit your cousin in Baltimore. It'll be fine, just say that. They're artists, right? So when they get to Customs and Border Protection, they're definitely going to say something other than what you told them to say. Artists, I hope that's okay. Don't be offended. They're definitely going to say something else. It's going to be the wrong thing, and they're going to get sent home. And then it's on you, and that screws up your relationship with your artist. So just please, the number of times I have to sort out these situations where the artist comes to me because they're the ones who got barred, they're the ones who got sent home, they're the ones who spent 24 hours in a holding cell in Los Angeles before they could get a flight back, and they're very upset. And then it comes down to like, well, my manager said it would be fine. I was like, oh, no. So, if you want to take the risk yourself, that's fine, that's up to you. I've had artists who have toured every year for 30 years in the US, never without a visa, and they've gotten away with it. It does happen, absolutely, but it's risky. Yeah?
If you apply for a visa and get denied, and then can you search for ESTA without them noticing?
You go through the whole visa application process and you get denied, you won't be allowed out on ESTA.
No, okay.
ESTA will not, once you have a visa denial, that goes into the system and ESTA will be denied.
But you can apply again.
For the visa?
Yes.
Yes, but there's no point applying again for ESTA because it will just keep, well, I mean, it's a terrible system, so it might possibly.
You won't be able to go on vacation even States if you get denied?
If you get denied for a visa, you'll have to, and you want to go on vacation like the next year, you'll have to apply for a tourist visa.
Yeah.
Which is...
But what is the difference? Like, ESTA is...
A tourist visa, in fact. It's like the absence of a tourist visa, but it's in place of a tourist visa. It's the same thing that the EU is about to set up, which is it's a system that's going in place like next year, which is the same thing where people coming to the EU will have to, to the Schengen area, will have to apply online, and then they don't have to get a visa, rather than just entering like I just did.
Additional question.
Is there another question? Yes.
So denial is, just to clarify, it's not when USCIS deny you, it's when you go to the embassy, right, for interview. That's when you deny, yes or no.
There's a bunch of different...
If they deny it, if they deny it, is that a deny, or is it when you go and actually interview at the embassy and deny you? Is that a final denial?
There's different denials that can happen along the line.
Yeah.
So if ESTA can be denied.
Yeah,
just like
I'm
you
thinking more like a B1 or O, or...
If you're applying for a B1, if there was a denial, the only place it would happen is at the embassy. When you go in and say, hey, I want to do this thing, they're like, no. That would be a denial there. If you're applying for and this is where we're heading right now, if you're applying for a P or an O employment visa, there's 2 steps to the process, and you could be denied at either one. But I'll get to that in a second. In fact, I'll get to it now. Okay, so there are a bunch of different kinds of visas that are employment-based visas, but almost all performing artists would use either an O visa or a P visa. An O visa is maximum duration is 3 years. We'll talk about durations in a minute because it's not that simple. It's for an O visa is always only for an individual person, and it's for an individual with extraordinary ability, whatever that means. And then if that person with extraordinary ability is traveling with crew or supporting musicians, you'd file a separate petition for an O2 support visa for them. P visas are generally for members of ensembles. The advantage of that is that you file a single petition for the whole ensemble. And so the individuals are getting a visa because of their relationship to that ensemble. So it's not that they individually are important, but they are a member of an important ensemble. P1 is for members of an ensemble with sustained international renown, whatever that means, we'll get to that. P2 doesn't apply to you folks, it's only for Canadians. P3 is for culturally unique artist or group. Now, I don't know any artists who don't think that the work they do is culturally unique. So that's not what they mean. But a lot of people who don't know what they're doing apply for a P3 thinking that what they're doing is culturally unique, but it's not what that means. Culturally unique means the art that you do is related to your home country's traditional culture. So folk music, indigenous music, folk theater, those kinds of things. A P3 is a great visa because the standard is very low. It's really easy to get them, but only if you're doing work that's connected to your country's traditional art forms. The reason for that is a little bit interesting, at least for me because I'm a lawyer. I don't know if it'll be interesting for you. All of these rules are here to protect the US labor market, right? They're all here to protect the interests of American musicians from having their jobs taken by foreigners. So the idea of the P3 is actually surprisingly forward, for the US government, surprisingly forward thinking. What they were realizing is that there are people who perform artwork that we don't already have in the US. So if, for example, you're an American, you have a venue and you want to present a Tuvan throat singer, chances are they need to come from Tuva, right? Not really, but that's the thinking. And so they don't have to be particularly famous or particularly good. They are just coming to present their traditional culture, which we don't already have, so we create this little weird P3 visa to allow that to happen. But But the problem with it is that the people who are making this decision are not particularly sophisticated culturally. So you have to be really careful with it because the thing about the P3 is it's really embedded deeply with a whole bunch of really problematic and racist ideas. So much so that getting a P3 visa for a European is actually kind of harder than getting a P3 visa for somebody from the global south. Because if you're playing an instrument that they don't know what it is, or if you're wearing costumes and they, oh, that looks weird, chances are you'll get the P3 visa. But you know, if an artist is like a folk musician coming from Ireland who's playing a guitar and a banjo, like, that looks like folk music to me. That's not like, so yeah, it's confusing. But anyway, so P3, I don't know if anybody is involved with folk music, but if it is, it's an option, but be careful with how it works. Each of these P1, P2, P3s has a secondary visa for crew. P1S, P2PS, and P3S. Now, there's a lot of overlap between these two, and it's strategic about which one you choose, and whomever you're working with, work with them to figure out the best idea. An example of how this gets confusing is if, I'm going to date myself here a little bit, if you're Elvis Costello, you can, and you're touring with the Attractions, you could tour as a P1 for Elvis Costello and the Attractions. That's an ensemble. And you could get all of the band under one visa application, which is cheaper than two, which you have here. You just put everybody under that. But it could only last for a year. Whereas you could also file two petitions, twice as much money, generally, and you could have Elvis get an O1 and get the Attractions in on an O2, which is going to cost you twice as much money up front, but you probably can get a 3-year visa, so you'd ultimately end up saving money. So it's kind of a strategic question of how to figure out which petition or which visa to actually go for. Okay, so those are the types of visas. Are any questions now before I move? Yes?
Just like if an artist gets the O visa and then as a manager you come back and forth, you can stay up to 3 months at a time and don't get the visa. You know,
so your artist gets an O1
yeah.
and you're the and you got an O2 as the manager?
Yeah, if I were to stay longer, but if I intend to go back and forth and not spend more than like 3 months at a time.
The 3 month thing doesn't matter with any of these. You can stay for as long as you want. Up
yeah,
to.
but if I don't, I mean if I don't choose to get one.
Oh, if you don't choose to get one. So you're going on ESTA.
Yeah.
Or a B1 if you get denied because you have a criminal record. I'm sorry about that. If you've got, well, what you're doing as a manager doesn't really matter because you haven't linked yourself in their system to the O1. If you, as a manager, you don't need an O2, but if for some reason you're kind of like, I'm kind of the road manager, I'm kind of the manager, I kind of do both of them, I'm already doing an O2 for the sound crew and for the like supporting musicians, so I might as well get on the O2 as well. That would be something I would probably advise you to do if you're the manager. So just throw yourself in there as road manager. Then you could go to the US for 3 years and hang out and live there and buy a house, whatever you want to do. All that could be done on the O2 if you wanted to.
And it's easy to get it extended as well after those 3 years.
Easy? I wouldn't say easy.
Easier than
easier. Right, well it's pretty much the same process. But it's very likely to be approved. Like, there is no extension, you apply again.
Yeah.
But when they see that you've already been approved once, they generally approve it again. Under the last administration, not so much. They were, say, like, under the Trump administration, this is insane, the policy was that anything decided by the Obama administration was probably wrong. So we're going to look at everything from the very beginning again. Now, the Biden administration has gone back to the previous way, which is like, you got approved before, you're probably fine. Anyway. Any other questions about the different visas? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
We actually noticed the effects of the Trump administration with the Muslim ban doing like this, both step by step first.
Yeah.
Like, how accurate is it today? Like, is this?
Okay.
Is there anything left in the administration? Because is there any reason? Is there any point to apply for the visa if you're born in
So
countries,
the Muslim
even though you're Swedish citizen. As an artist.
So the Muslim ban is over. Like that was revoked immediately.
Sure.
Yeah. And in reality, it has been. Like that is not a problem. There is still this thing called the extreme vetting process, which was super focused on the global south during the Trump administration. We thought it was going to disappear because it's so fucked up and such a terrible thing. It hasn't disappeared. It's very disappointing. We've had some indication from the current administration that they're going to review it and maybe get rid of it, but for the moment, it's actually kind of expanded so that if there's something, it just basically, it's a process where you apply for a visa and for some reason they think you're suspect. Whatever that reason might be, I don't really understand. I mean, it's usually fairly traceable, like a criminal record, or you've traveled a lot in North Korea or something like that, or you're a nuclear scientist or something. But when you get this extreme vetting process, it basically pulls you out of the normal processing time, and it takes another 3 months. Doesn't happen very often, certainly not for Swedes very often, but it could happen. So that's still there. The main problems with processing aren't the same ones now that they were under the Trump administration, which was just like Muslim travel ban, just like sort of explicitly racist and profiling.
But you're still a suspect if you're not born in Sweden and have a Swedish passport.
Not necessarily, no. Because if you're, again, if you have a Swedish passport and you've had it for a couple of years, and like say you're born in Syria or Somalia, but you've emigrated to Sweden and you have a Swedish passport and you're settled, very settled in Sweden, you're probably not going to have a problem. You would have, definitely, under the Trump administration. Now, I don't think you're going to have a problem like everybody else does, which is you can't get an interview because everybody's delayed. But I don't think you're going to have a problem because of your country of birth. So things are getting better. Yes?
If you have a P1 and you apply for your crew to come on tour, do you have to prove that they're extraordinary or unique, or would they say that you can hire a US crew rather than bring the Swedish crew?
You've got a P1 and you're trying to convince them that you need a P1S for your crew? Is that what you're asking about? Do you have to show that the crew is unique?
Well, can you bring your crew without saying that they are extraordinary?
Yeah. The crew doesn't need to be extraordinary, which is good because that's really hard. But what you do need to prove is that you have a relationship with them. Like you can't. And there's a lot of different ways to prove it. It's not usually a problem, but if you can show that the people who are members of your crew have some sort of sustained work history with you. Like if you came to me and said, hey, I want to get a P1 for my band, and a week before we go to the US, we're going to do a week of rehearsals with our road crew, and we're applying 3 months in advance, and I can't show that the road crew has ever worked with the band before, that's going to be a problem. But if you've got a sound person and a light person and a front of house person that you've worked with for some time, and we can document some degree of a historical working relationship with those individuals, it shouldn't be a problem.
And is it the same if you're a solo artist and you bring your musicians, and you need to prove that you work with them for?
Same thing, yeah. And again, this is entirely labor policy. They're assuming if you haven't worked with them before, that there's no reason you shouldn't be hiring U.S. crew or U.S. backing musicians. Which isn't true, of course, but that's the assumption, yeah.
So on the O2 visa, you can like apply for your entire crew on one visa?
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, there's an Irish musician we work with of some renown, and he has a bunch of different projects. He's got a solo work, he's got a duo, he's got a band, he's got kind of another band that he does. I mean, there's a bunch of crew. Each of these different like structures has a different sound person. What we do with him every 3 years is we get him on O1, and then like half of Dublin goes on to the O2, so that when he goes out on tour, he'd be like, you you come with me, and the rest stay home. So if you've got a large ensemble, that's kind of, or if you've got a bunch of different projects, that's a good way to do it. The O2s don't always have to tour with the O1. Any other questions? This is good. This is good. Good questions. Yeah?
Yeah, I had a question regarding, like, I have friends that kind of answer the question. They're a duo.
Mm-hmm.
They have a visa. They say, you might as well just join ours.
So
then the relationship
so you're wondering if that's
has to be
legal?
proven to work. We worked together before, but not like
yeah.
on a regular basis.
So yeah, you could, if they're a duo and you've worked together.
The proof is not strong.
The proof is not strong. So there's two places where that could go wrong. One is if you file the application. For the application for the again, I haven't told you how this is done yet, but the petition is filed, which has the evidence about the ensemble, and it's clearly a duo. You know, all the press talks about the two people, and you know, the album cover has two people on it, and there's a third person. There's going to be questions about that. Who is this third person? I mean, you can theoretically get over it if you have evidence. It's like, well, you know, this is a duo, but I am the keyboardist and I'm always in the shadows, right? That would be, you could probably get through with that. I've done a visa for like an ensemble that's called the, you know, such and such duo, and there's 5 people on the petition, and it still works if you can, you know, you go through the effort of proving it. But the thing is this, if what they're saying is like, just get the visa, and then like you go do your thing and we'll go do our thing, that's not allowed. Yeah. Yes?
So, the Homeland Security want to raise the petition cost. Are you going to come to petition, or should I ask about it?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
Any more questions about the different kinds of visas? Okay, moving on. How do you get a visa? Take a picture of this. Okay. Everybody ready? All right, moving on. It's a 2-step process. There's a petition that's filed in the US. The petition is often hundreds of pages of documentation. It's a big project. It's expensive. Part of the expense is the filing fee. The union has to issue a consultation. That is expensive. If you hire a lawyer to do it, I'm sorry, that even is more expensive. Lawyers are the worst when it comes to that stuff. But that petition is it's a request for a work authorization. You can't apply for the visa, a P or an O visa, without this being approved first. So first you file this in the US. It's traditionally filed by whoever's employing you. For musicians, for touring musicians, that's hard because you have a different employer every night if you're on a tour. So like if you're going to work for a tech company, you know, Microsoft would file the petition for you. And they're saying, I'm going to hire this person, and they demonstrate why it is that you should get this job, or you should get the visa to do the job. For a touring musician, it's complex because you have different employers, but basically the idea is a US entity files a petition, and the petition has to prove 2 things. It has to prove that the artist meets the standard. So if it's an O1, it has to prove the artist has extraordinary ability. If it's a P1, you have to show that the artist is a member of an ensemble with sustained international renown. Basically, it has to show, the petition shows that you're pretty famous, and it has to show that you have actual work in the US. These are unrelated, so the work doesn't have to be impressive. You don't have to be like making a ton of money. You just have to show that you are contracted to do something. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about how to prove that you have extraordinary ability, because that's really complex. And you probably don't have to figure this out for yourself. You'll probably do this with an agent or a lawyer or somebody who understands it. But basically, I would say this. If you are at a point in your career where someone in the US wants you to perform in the US, then you're probably going to be eligible for the visa. if you're at a point in your career where nobody in the US wants you, but you really want to go on tour in the US just because you think it'd be really interesting and you feel like you're going to get there and I'm going to make a bunch of connections, you might not be ready. You might not be eligible. Yes?
But it's a little bit of a catch-22 with the time, because when you're early on in your career as artist, then usually it's very last-minute requests, like, yeah, if you want to go on tour with this artist and be a supporting act, we're starting in a week or in a month.
Totally.
You know.
Totally.
So the thought of like trying to process the visa before getting the actual request, like how do you go about that?
That's very much intentional. That's why they're trying to make it harder for people who are not far along in their career to tour in the US. The idea is do that in your home country, do that outside the US, get to the point where you have somewhere down, and then apply for the visa, which is not a very welcoming way to handle the situation, but that's how it's structured. The way that, so proving you have renown, you can develop, it's not renown in the US, it's wherever you are. So if you've gotten to the point where your band has toured some internationally, you've played some big festivals, you've played some good venues, you've got some good press, chances are you could get a P1 visa. Or you could show that, chances are you can show that you're a member of an ensemble with sustained international renown. So that part's probably going to be fine. The second part of showing that you have employment, that's tricky because the duration of the visa is only going to cover the span of time that you've proven you need it. So if you've got one gig that's contracted, you're probably going to get a visa that lasts for a week to cover that one gig. So here's a caution about lawyers. I'm sorry. There is no incentive for US lawyers to get you a long visa because it's harder work to get a long visa, and the longer the visa, the less often you have to come back to them and pay them again to get another visa. So the tendency amongst most American attorneys and agencies is like, oh, you've got a 3-week tour? Well, we'll get you a 3-week visa. Here you go. And then like, oh, it goes really well. I get an offer to come back 6 months later. Oh, you got to go through the whole process over again. So be careful when you're working on this kind of thing because it's usually possible to get the full duration. So for a P1, you should be able to get the full year if you work at it and the person you're working with works at it. If you're going for an O1, it should be possible in most situations to get the full 3 years if whomever you're working with is willing to work at it. Now the way it's done, and again, this is something a lot of people don't understand, but the way it's done, am I getting way, I'm totally off here, but that's okay. To prove that you've got bona fide employment in the US, you can show gigs. That's what they're looking for. Like, oh, you've got 15 shows over 2 months. Great, here's your 2-month visa. But you could also show that you have a contractual relationship with an agent, or with a label, or with a publishing company. And the easiest thing is to work with it. If you've got a US agent, or somebody who's functioning in an agent position, and you've got a contract with them, or they're willing to sign a contract with you for the sake of the visa that lasts for 3 years, then what you can say with the petition is, okay, I have extraordinary ability, here's a pile of press and resume stuff, and I've got this contract with an agent that lasts for the next 3 years. I don't have gigs yet, but the point of the contract with the agent is to get gigs. And so that contract itself with the agent, even though it doesn't specify actual gigs, the contract with the agent is usually enough to get a full, for an O1, a full 3-year visa. A lot of agents, a lot of visa agents and attorneys either don't understand that or don't want to understand that. But know, as artists and managers, know when you're going into the process of getting a visa that you should start from the assumption, like, we're going to get the full duration. And push, and whoever you're working with, push them on that, because they might resist, and they shouldn't. They should be working with you to get a long duration. And there's ways to do it legally.
So it could be smart also to try aim for having like a US agent, live agent, Because there are some big
Doesn't necessarily, I mean, this gets really into the legal weeds. It doesn't actually have to be a US agent. If you've got, say, a Swedish agent who's booking you in the US, you will need a US entity to file the petition. But they can file the petition on behalf of the Swedish agent. So what you'd file is you'd file a petition where it's like the US entity representing the Swedish agent representing you for the next 3 years. So that works. It's legally complex, so you want to work with somebody who knows how to explain this to the government, because the government will get confused, because they're not that smart. But it's totally possible.
I just mean if you have options.
Yeah.
Then, you know, getting a US agent might be smoother.
It would be smoother, but a lot of times it's hard to get a US agent early on in your career, and it's not the only way to do it. Other questions?
You do need a petition to apply for a visa, or you can't just apply.
The petition has to be applied, yeah. You have to have a US entity to file the petition. It could be anything. Any contact you, it could be your cousin. That same cousin who lives in Baltimore, they could be the petitioner if you want. They don't have to be in the industry. But it's better, like if you've got a publishing company, if you've got a venue that you've got a strong relationship with, any of these entities could be the petitioner.
So when the USCIS want to raise the petition now cost Homeland Security, is that a final decision by the Biden administration, or is it Homeland Security who can take the decision?
The fee increase? That will be, again, I'll get to that in a little bit. Am I out of time yet? No. Am I okay? No. Okay, good. Remember, I haven't slept, so I might be here all day. If you all start to leave, it's okay. I'll just keep.
No, Matthew, maybe 20 more minutes.
Oh, that's fine. I can do that. The fee thing, there's a lot of fuss about it. I don't know if it's even going to happen. It's a decision that's made by Homeland Security, but there's a lot of lawsuits that are being prepared if they try and do it. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not naturally a very optimistic person, but I kind of don't think this is probably going to happen.
Lawsuits from Americans?
Yeah. Immigration attorneys, because it's not just musicians. Like it's all employers. It's all employers are having to do this. So there's a lot of pushback about it. It might happen, but it's not legally very sound. One other thing I want to caution you about. When you're talking about a petitioner, if you are an artist and you're working with a label, be a little bit careful about who your petitioner is, because it's possible to file the petition in such a way that the relationship between the artist and the agent is the basis of the petition. So imagine you go to South by Southwest on ESTA, you've got a great gig, goes really well. Agent you've never heard of comes up to you and is like, hey, you were awesome, dude. I really want to sign you. And you're like, I don't know, you seem like an idiot. But you're the only agent who comes up to me, so I really want to get a visa. I need an agent. So you sign a contract with this agent, right? And you make sure that you can get out of it, right? In case they turn out to be an idiot. Right, so then working with that agent, you spend thousands of dollars in 6 months to get your visa. You do the tour is a disaster because the agent's terrible. But while you're touring, you meet another agent who actually isn't an idiot and says, you know what, you shouldn't be working with this guy because he's an idiot, but I really want to work with you. Let's do this right. Let's look toward 2024. I want to find an anchor at some good festivals, some big summer shows. I've got some real good leads on opening sets that you can do with some amazing artists. Let's do this properly. You know, like, totally, let's do this. I'm going to jump ship from my idiot agent, this new agent. Well, guess what? Your visa's linked to the first agent. So as soon as you leave that agent and go to the new agent, you have to start the visa process all over again. It doesn't have to be that way. That's one way to file a petition. You can file a petition so that you are functioning more as a free agent if you're willing to use a different petitioner, like a non-interested petitioner. So for example, if you've got an agent, but you also have a publishing company in the who doesn't really care who you're working with, maybe use your publishing company as your petitioner so that you can ditch the agent if you want to. Agents, I'm sorry, you don't want to hear this, I know, but that way you can ditch the agent and shift to a new one if it turns out that that doesn't turn out to work well. Like, does that make sense? So just be a little bit careful that it's possible to kind of be indentured to the petitioner. So be careful about who your petitioner is. Yeah.
Does it necessarily need to be linked to a person, or is it okay with an organization? Or
it could be either way. When the petition's filed, it can be filed as the agency, it could be filed as the agent. One thing that Tamizdat does is we act as the petitioner for thousands of artists every year. For this very reason, to make sure that they have the right to work with whomever they want to. It helps them be a free agent and not tied to potentially bad or abusive relationships with agents or labels. Yes?
So if you have like the possibility to have your cousin like be your petitioner, why wouldn't you do that?
Maybe your cousin doesn't want to file a petition with Homeland Security. Also, I think that, it's hard to know. Sometimes the Homeland Security might look at like your cousin and be like, why are you filing this? What does this have to do with it? And the petition is a complex process. So if it's being prepared by an experienced attorney, but the petitioner is your cousin, you're probably fine. If it's actually your cousin trying to do this themselves, that's probably going to be a mess. I don't know your cousin though, but maybe you've got a really savvy cousin. It's possible. Yeah. Do
you need a visa to have a contract? You don't need a visa to have a contract with like a distribution company.
No. It's only for physically your body going to the U.S. to do things. You can do anything you want on TikTok or whatever. You can make money through any non-body go to U.S. situation. All that's fine. So that's what a petition is. That's the thing that you file to get a work authorization. It takes, right now it's taking about 2 to 3 months for it to be processed. Sometimes it gets longer, sometimes it gets shorter. You can go really fast. You can do it in 2 weeks if you're willing to pay them the expediting fee, which is $2,500. So obviously you want to avoid that. If you're going with a crew, so it's like an O1 and an O2 or a P1 and a P1S, that's 2 times $2,500 for expediting. So it really quickly gets very expensive at that point. So you want to be starting this process ideally like 5 months in advance if you can. Yes?
Hi. So I'm an American citizen,
okay,
but my artist is not. Does the petitioner have to be like from a third party, or can I do it?
You're an American citizen, you're an artist, you're a manager?
Yes.
Okay. You could be the petitioner if you want to. Okay. In fact, that might be a really good idea. Because then you're overseeing the process and assuming you've got a good relationship with the artist. Okay. When the petition is filed, it's a huge stack of paper, which is proving the renown of the artist and proving the contractual base of the engagement in the U.S. If they are not satisfied with it, if they're like, this looks good, but not quite, they might send it back and do a request for evidence. It's a second chance, basically. They list the things that they don't like about it. Sometimes they're really well written, and they're like, you did, 4 of the 5 things we're looking for, but the 5th one we have a question about this, and you're like, oh, that's easy, here's the answer. Sometimes they're really poorly written, and they're just like, I don't think you submitted any evidence. There was 150 pages, like, whatever. So the request for evidence is something that is, I would say, we get requests for evidence on about 5% of the petitions we file. We probably overcome 95% of the requests for evidence. So if you know what you're doing, this is not a really big problem, but it can slow you down. And if you're getting down to the wire and the tour date is coming up, the request for evidence can be a big problem for out of time. Denial happens really rarely if you've gotten to this point. It can happen. Normally, if your petition is denied, all they're saying is like, we don't think you're really famous enough yet. and come back when you're more famous. It could be after the first album comes out. It could be just put together a better petition. It's not a black spot on your passport if you get a denial of a petition. It's a denial without prejudice, which just simply means you're not quite there yet. Try again. If the reason for denial is they think that you forged something, like you created fake contracts or a fake itinerary of shows, and they called the venues, and the venues were like, yeah, we've never heard of this artist, you might get a denial with prejudice, which means like, we think you're fraudulent. That could have a problem. That could be problems in the future, which is why you don't make up stuff. And if your agent says, oh, I'm just going to make an itinerary of fake dates for the next 3 years, which a lot of them don't do that, because they do check sometimes, and when they do check and they find out that it's fake, that's fraud, it doesn't help anybody. So try to avoid that situation. Moving on. Okay, so petitions applied, petition gets submitted to the US, shows that you have renown, shows that you've got work. There's a request for evidence, they ask for a couple little details, you supply them, you've still got some time, the petition is approved. Notification of the approval of the petition is sent to US embassies around the world and consulates. At that point, you can apply for the visa. So you fill out a form online, the DS-160 form. It's, again, terrible technology. It crashes all the time. I'm sorry. As an American, I'm sorry. Then usually you have to schedule an interview at the US Embassy. These days, it's oftentimes they waive that. If you seem particularly not threatening to them, then they might be like, okay, just mail it in. The problem with the mailing in is the mailing in takes longer than doing the interview. So if your time period is tight, like if you've got 3 weeks before your tour and they're like, yeah, you don't need to do an interview, you're like, yeah, but I want to do the interview because you'll get the passport back faster, so be careful about that. But you go in and do the interview. The interview for people from Sweden is not much. It's not very complex. You just go in and say, I'm going on tour, this is my agent, this is the tour that's happening, these are the dates, and you'll be fine. Don't stress a lot about the interview process. If there is a problem, I'm not going to go into these details, but if there is a problem, usually it's resolved fairly quickly. A 221G is a denial technically, but it just means they need to think about it, which means like if you've got anything in your passport or in your record that seems strange to them, they'll probably deny you pending review. And then they look into it and realize, oh, the reason that you traveled to Syria was because you were on a religious mission there in 2008 and it's fine. And then they're like, okay, it takes an extra 2 weeks to review that, and then they give you the passport back. But you want to leave time, because if there is anything to delay it, you don't want to like miss the tour date because they're sitting on your passport. So try to leave, at least 3 weeks. And if you've got if you know there's something in your record that's going to cause a problem, leave more time than that. Chances are you won't be denied. So I'm not going to go into that. So once you get the petition approved, once you get the visa approved, they give the actual physical visa, goes into your passport, then you travel to the US. And if all of those things are done properly, there's almost never a problem when you enter the US. The problems that you hear about when people enter the US is usually because something was done wrong in the first two parts. You got the wrong visa, you didn't get a visa. Those are the horror stories you hear about in the music press. Is usually it's something that happened beforehand that plays out when you get to the border. What's next? Entering U.S. Yeah.
I think it's good to point out that the Swedish embassy is not very good on it can be very long queues to get the interview times to be in time for that.
Yeah, that's completely true, although all of that is changing so much. It changes literally every week. Like I just checked with my colleagues about the Stockholm embassy, because I knew there had been a bunch of problems, but I know that like as of last week, the processing times were really much shorter than 3 weeks ago. But next week, it could get long again. If you go online to the embassy website to try and schedule an appointment, and it tells you no appointments available until June 2024. That's not the end of the road. What you do is you apply, you take that appointment in June 2024, and then you send a request. And there's a little button to do it. You send a request for a sooner interview, and usually those are approved. Okay. What else? How long does it take? Step one, as I just said, you want to start like 4 or 5 months in advance. If you get a really amazing offer and you're willing to spend the money, you can probably turn this around in a month if you're working with somebody who knows what they're doing and your embassy is cooperative.
How much money are you talking about?
A band, no crew. So it's just one petition. Doing it long enough in advance that you don't need to expedite it, which is super expensive. The government filing fee is currently $460. You're going to have to pay $250 to the union. This is for the whole ensemble, okay, right? $460.
Now we're talking about the ensemble, but we're doing the O1 is the
If
same.
it's an O1, it's the same, but it's only one person. But like if it's a whole orchestra,
Yeah.
it's still the same.
Okay.
So $460 is the filing fee to cover the act. Probably $250 to the union.
$350.
Depends on the union.
Okay.
Some unions are more. It also there's expediting fees for the unions. The fee per person for the visa at the embassy is currently $190. That's probably going to go up soon, but not a lot. Probably going to go up to like $212. But so there's a per person cost to actually have the visas issued. And then there's the cost of hiring somebody to do it for you. And that, the cost of that varies a huge amount depending on who you hire. I think the cheapest legitimate agency I know is about $1,500, $1,500 to do the process. I've seen lawyers charge as much as $10,000 for an L1. That's ridiculous. Don't pay that. That's too much. It's not that hard. Especially some festivals, still do their own in-house. If they've done it before, that's fine, and they know what they're doing. Sometimes we mop up a lot of problems where somebody says, I can do this myself, and then like 3 weeks later, or 3 months later, it's a disaster. Like, traveling in 3 weeks, what do I do? So if you're working with somebody who says, yeah, we're going to do this, your label says, we've never done it before, but we're going to get you a visa, like, be careful, because it probably won't work. But yeah, so there's the cost of filing. So the fixed cost for an ensemble, like say it's a 4-piece, $460, $250, roughly $200 per person. So you're talking around somewhere under $1,500 for the fixed costs of the fees, and then probably another $1,500 to $2,000 somewhere between $1,500 and $3,000 for the legal fees of preparing it. So under $4,000. What?
From the start to the end.
Yeah.
Plus
Exactly.
the express cost if you have to do that.
Plus the express cost
which
is
you also
$2,000.
do because you're getting the date so late from the agent. And
Right, exactly.
you don't
And
want
how
to take a
much
risk.
was the express cost? Was
The expediting cost is $2,500.
$2,000.
Right, and that's where it starts getting really expensive.
I would say between $7,000 to $10,000 for a group with the express.
With a crew, yeah. If it's just the one petition, that's more. I think you need to spend. I think that if you're expediting, 6 to 7 probably thousand. If you're not expediting, you could do it for under 5. But what's really important about this, when you're thinking about the costs, then you realize why getting a long duration is so important. Because if you're doing this whole thing and spending $5,000 or $7,000 to get a visa, and it only covers 3 weeks, that's ridiculous. Don't let anybody lead you down that path. If you're going to spend all that money, you want to make sure you're getting the longest possible duration, so that you can prorate the cost over multiple tours. So step 1, ideally, again, avoiding the expediting 5 months in advance if you can. Step 2, This is the problem. This is the part that's getting the visa at the embassy. It's really complex and slow right now, but normally isn't that bad. So hopefully by the end of the year, it will be getting back to normal again. Again, we talked about that, how long the work visa lasts. Right? How is it different right now? The petition process isn't that different. It's always been bad, and it's just about as bad as it always is. So it's nothing new. The consular process is a big problem right now. Leave time for that. Okay, some important resources. This website, artistfromabroad.org, is an amazing definitive source of information on how to do this. It also covers taxes, which is super useful, and I don't even want to go there because it's even more painful and boring than what I'm talking about. But this is an amazing source. This is our pro bono legal assistance service. Basically, these are designed to work together. Like, go here, answer your questions. If you can't find your answer there, then email us or call us, and we'll help you figure out what it is that you didn't understand from looking here. The League of American Orchestras is we work with to run this, and that's also a really, if you're dealing with an orchestra, that's a really great resource as well. They're really helpful. And this isn't about the US so much, but just you should know it's out there. On the Move is a Brussels-based NGO that addresses issues about artist mobility everywhere. And so if you're trying to tour outside of Sweden, especially if you're trying to tour outside of the Schengen area, so like, what do I need to know about touring in the UK now that there's Brexit? Checking On the Move is an amazing resource, and you can either, they have a lot of information on their website, but they also link to other organizations like Tamizdat in different countries to help you with whatever issues you have. So this is also just a really amazing organization to be aware of and useful. Is that the last page? This is a little plug for what we're trying to do. We do a lot of work to try and change this and make it better. It's a very slow process. The Biden administration has been more receptive and more willing to talk about change than any administration in the last 20 years. So that's positive. We are meeting with them and talking about how the process could be made more transparent, more affordable, more promotive of the arts, and they are listening, which is great. And hopefully by the end of the administration, we will have actually made some real changes. But again, it's slow, like all things with the government is. I think that's that's it. Other questions? Are we done? Is that, out of time?
You're the headline. Yeah.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Boom.
But if you have time.
If there's more questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
Yeah, one more question.
I do have one. Thank you for sorting this out for us.
Sure.
One question. In regards to O1s and O2s, what are the rules for O2s traveling without the O1s?
You can travel apart.
Yeah.
You don't have to be on the same flight.
How far apart? 6 months. Preparations.
I was thinking about that too. Can it be on like...
That's a good question. See, the thing about it is that, like, once they admit, like, you can come and say, hey, the O2's coming tomorrow, I'm coming to advance.
Yep.
The project, I've got to set up the stage.
Right.
And they're like, okay, that makes sense. What if the O1 isn't coming for another month or 6 months? They have no way of knowing that, and they have no way of monitoring it. And
or not coming at all.
Well, then what are you doing there as an O2?
No, preparing, setting something up. That's a short term.
Sure, but the question is like, so again, this is the question of the law. The law, there's no problem with it. The reality is if they can see they can look up and see what the traveling of the O1 is. And if you've got a situation where you've got an O2 who comes in and out of the US regularly for 3 years, and the O1 has never been here, they're going to see that when you come through. I mean, not necessarily, but they can see it. And if they start seeing a record that looks suspicious, they're going to start asking questions. So certainly O2s travel without O1s all the time. That's not a problem. But if it becomes a pattern that looks weird, then you might run into a problem. Good question, though. Yeah?
Do the U.S. administration recognize that it's not at all so difficult for U.S. artists to tour Europe as it is for European ones, and special upcoming ones?
Yeah. They don't care at all.
They don't care.
So it's a trade war.
Well, it would be a war if the EU fought back, but it's not. Because,
right?
No, I mean, I get this question at almost every session in Europe, and I would like to say yes, increase your trade barriers, but honestly, it doesn't make any difference because you could make it just as hard for American artists to come to Europe, but there's no one in the US who's going to notice and do anything about it.
So you mean that they wouldn't take down the bars? It would only be by raising them that
the way we're going to bring down the bars in the US, I mean, gets into sort of advocacy policy. If you made it suddenly thousands of dollars for US artists to tour in Europe, I honestly don't think it would make any difference because I don't think the people who control that in the US care about the damage that would do to American artists. I'd like to say otherwise. I'd like to say that there's actual leverage there, but I don't think in reality there is. But that's a debate that we can have in the bar afterwards. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I was thinking again to be like proactive before a new administration potentially comes into power and before getting opportunities to tour. Is it a good idea to try get a visa just by having like a contract with publishing or distribution, or is it very tour focused?
It doesn't have to be tour focused, and I don't think trying to gain one administration versus another, I don't think it's worth doing. Like we've had a lot of people come and saying like, oh, the fees are going to go up, and oh, we didn't really talk about that. Sorry, the fee. There's been a proposal for the fees to go up. The proposal is only the filing fee. So when you read in the press like, oh, the cost of touring in America is going to go up 300%, people are panicking because they're thinking, I'm paying $5,000 to get a visa and now it's going to be $15,000. That's not what's happening. What's happening is the filing fee might go from $460 for an ensemble up to $1,500. So it's another $1,000. That's real. That's not nothing, but it's also not what the media seems to be making people think about. Like it's bad. I agree. That shouldn't be an extra $1,000. But when you're already paying $7,000, an extra $1,000 is not going to ruin most tours. I'm not trying to excuse it. It's a terrible idea, but it's not.
But it's not what people think.
It's not what people think it is. Right. Any other questions? You've been very patient. This is a really boring topic, so thank you for sitting here. If you have like case-specific questions about like your own artists, I'd be happy to talk with you about it afterwards. Is that it?
I think a couple of notes. I've been dealing with O1s and O2s over the last 10 years, and a couple of notes on the expediting fees is that if you get you pay $2,500 for that, that it could be, that could be a lot for, then you have a couple of individuals, and then that could multiply quite a lot, and then if you have any sort of comment back from them, those 10 days, it's 10 days, right? That they have to turn it around, right?
If they send a comment back to you, you've got 60 days to respond.
Yeah, but then once it starts over again.
Right, but once you respond to it, then they've got 15 days to respond to that. Yeah.
So that's been an issue for us a couple of times where it's new members of the crew or something, then they, something went wrong, and then all of a sudden you paid your $2,500, which is a lot, and then you're not getting it in time.
Right.
Oh, is that the fast track?
Right, so you fast track it. So say you're touring a month, right?
Yeah.
Oh God, so I'm going to pay the $2,500.
Yeah.
You file it a month out, and then you get a request for evidence.
Could be a small detail.
Like a little detail, like the petition says that they were born in 1812. Is that really true? It's like, oh crap, typo. Right, so you change that. You say, no, they weren't born in 1812. Not true. But then they have another 15 days, so suddenly the 15 plus 15, and you've missed your tour.
Yeah.
So
done it.
Yeah, so you've done it, right? So which is why, when we're working with a client, when we're trying to figure out what the timeline is, if they're going to spend the $2,500 to expedite, we're probably going to say, well, we should be paying that $2,500 at least 6 weeks out, so that if there is a request for evidence and we have to answer it, then there's still going to be 2 weeks at the end to get the visa at the embassy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we do a lot of like working back from what the departure date is.
And also remember that you're not going to have your passport for 7 days, you know.
Right.
That's also
Right now, yeah, at best.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay.
All right.